The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Professing Atheist. So in my debates with apologists, particularly Christian apologists, they'll often refer to atheists as professed atheists or a professing atheist. Cy ten Bruggencate said he wouldn't do a Bible study with professed atheists, and Jay Lucas referred to me and other atheists as professed atheists. So what does this mean? Well, we know that to profess something just means to declare it openly. Why would you add professed or professing to the atheist label? This all actually stems from Christianity, where they have an idea of professing Christians. These are people who openly declare Christianity, but may not really be Christians. And the Bible supports this idea that there are many people, there will be many who call me Lord, Lord, etc. These aren't real Christians. Okay, I get that. But where do we get this idea of professed or professing atheist, and what does it actually mean? Well, if you take a look in the dictionary, if you do a Google search for the definition of a word, the most common usage, which is usually the first entry listed, points out that this label is most often used when someone is outwardly professing something that inwardly isn't true or maybe false. And so the foundation for this claim, this accusation that we're professing atheists, rests with a couple of different passages in the Bible. One being in Psalms 14, I believe, where the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. The other primary source for this comes from Romans, where basically God has revealed himself to everyone. The truth of God's existence is written in the universe, and we are all without excuse. As a matter of fact, when I questioned Cy about this during our debate, and I asked him, what do you mean when you say that I know that God exists? Because I'm sitting here saying I don't believe that a God exists, and you're calling me a professing atheist, and then asserting that I may say I don't believe, but I actually know. And in fact, in Cy's view, I'm absolutely certain, because we all are. Well, are they necessarily calling us liars? No. And that's the thing that I want to caution atheists about the most. Don't necessarily assume that they're calling you a liar. They may be, but you need to ask questions to get to that, because there is also within Christianity this view that we are given over to a reprobate mind, that we may have been deceived by Satan. If you listen to some of them, they say we know this, but we suppress it. So somehow they're simultaneously using the awareness version of knowledge. You are aware of the facts. And then saying that we suppress it, which would mean we're not aware of it. There's a little confusion here about belief and knowledge and their interaction. So maybe we'll take a look at that for just a second. In simplest terms, when we say we believe something, we are simply saying that we are convinced that this is the case. We accept that the proposition that has been presented to us is true or likely true. When we say we know something, philosophically, that is often defined as justified true belief. And this version of knowledge or know is kind of specific. It represents perhaps a confidence level, colloquially, that we're really, really convinced. It represents the idea that we have good reason and justification for it, and that the claim is in fact true. Now, there's a lot of different problems with that. But there are other usages for the word know. For example, just awareness. Somebody could say, hey, your house is on fire, and you could say, I know. You're not necessarily making an epistemological claim about knowledge. You're using the word know to simply mean that you are aware of this fact. There's also familiarity, as in, I know Bob. I know Bob quite well. And so we're having a slightly different usage of the term know there as well. Now, while there are other usages of know, I'm wondering which of these is in play when an apologist wants to label an atheist as a professing atheist and say that they actually do know. Now, in the case with someone like Cy, it's really confused, because he, on some occasions, will say, when I said, what do you mean by we know that God exists? He would say something like, you have sufficient understanding of God to justify your condemnation, condemnation, which is really not saying much, if anything at all. And he will also say, you suppress it. You have knowledge of God, but you suppress it. So if we're suppressing it, then we're not aware of it. So we can throw out the awareness. Maybe we're talking about a familiarity, like I know God, I know Bob, but I don't remember Bob. Maybe that's the case. But I don't think that we can anyway be talking about knowledge from a philosophical standpoint as a justified true belief, because I don't see any way that someone could know as knowledge a particular claim and not believe it. Knowledge is a subset of belief within that context. And so knowledge is a belief that is both justified and true under the philosophical definition. So it therefore requires belief. This is what brings many atheists to immediately object that the Christian apologist is accusing them of lying. And as I pointed out, that's something to be cautioned against. It is best to ask the questions, get them to define, what do you mean by I know that God exists? Do you mean that I'm just aware of it? Do you mean, I actually do believe, even though I'm saying I don't believe? And what's going on here? Am I intentionally lying about what I believe? Get them to, back up their claim and acknowledge what they're actually saying. Because otherwise, if you react by, oh, you're just calling me a liar, then they have an immediate defense, which is, well, I'm not necessarily saying you're lying. I'm not claiming you're dishonest about this. You're just a poor soul that's been deceived and repressed, and you may not even be aware of what you know, which is also a problem, by the way, because now they're claiming to not only have an understanding of the inner workings of your mind and how it's gone wrong, but this often carries with it the idea that they can't be wrong. That not only do they know you better than you know yourself, but they have this supernatural guarantor who is giving them the information that you are in fact deceived. How convenient that you happen to have a friend who can know my mind and he just happens to be siding with you, and we have absolutely no way of confirming any of this. The only real problem here that is damning, and this is where we might start talking about where Christians might want to caution themselves, is that I know that I'm not intentionally trying to deceive someone. I honestly don't believe that a God exists. I've searched every crevice of my mind that I have access to. I know what it feels like to be lying. I know what it feels like to believe one thing and say something else. We all do. We all know the feeling of duplicity. We all know the feeling of dishonesty. And when I talk about how I don't believe that a God exists, I'm not exercising any dishonesty. And so when somebody tells me that I am in fact exercising dishonesty, I've learned quite a bit actually from that conversation. I've learned that they don't actually know the inner workings of my mind. I don't necessarily know that their God is false, or that their God is incorrect, or that their God is lying, or that they're even lying about what they believe. All I know is they're wrong. And if the information that they're offering is purportedly coming from someone or something that can't be wrong, now we have essentially, in logical terms, a reductio ad absurdum that demonstrates that either their God doesn't exist, or he can be wrong, or they have misunderstood their God, etc. In any case, the model that they've built about having an all-knowing God who has revealed to them that you're lying is falsified by the fact that you aren't lying. And that's one possible way to address this issue, is to say, how would you feel if I told you that you're just a professed Christian, and that I got this information from my infallible source that can't be wrong? Turning the tables on this can help people realize that what they're saying isn't helping them make their case, and is in fact working against them making their case. Imagine that you're a defense attorney and your client has been accused of murder, and you're sitting in the courtroom, and the prosecution has the burden of proof of demonstrating that your client is actually guilty. And they've done their work in establishing a motive and trying to find some evidence that It would ultimately result in a conviction against your client. But they haven't been able to place him at the scene. They have no evidence that actually ties your client directly to the scene. If you as a defense attorney get up in this situation and say, my client could not possibly have been at that scene because he was over here doing this, you've now adopted a burden of proof. This is incredibly dangerous. If you cannot, in fact, back up what you've said, this would be a great way to demonstrate somebody's innocence of a crime. If the crime, took place in, Mississippi, and your client was demonstrably, clearly, provably in New Jersey at the exact time, then it'd be very difficult to demonstrate that they are guilty. But if you make this claim and you have no way to demonstrate that your client was in Hoboken, you have done something incredibly damaging to your case. Because the scenario right now is we don't have any demonstration that your client was actually at the scene of the crime. That's enough, in many cases, for the jury to have reasonable doubts. That's a strong element of the case that needs to be made, and the prosecution has that burden of proof. The strongest thing that you can do is point that out, that there's no evidence tying your client to the scene of the crime. When you then expand this and overreach and say, in fact, my client was somewhere else, you've now adopted a burden of proof, and you have a responsibility to meet that burden. And if it turns out that you can't, if it turns out that you were just making it up or that you were wrong about it, you've now done incredible damage to your client. Because from the jury's standpoint, yeah, the prosecution still can't put him at the scene of the crime, but the person who's representing him tried to claim that he was somewhere else, but couldn't demonstrate that either. Or worse, it's been shown that the individual couldn't have been at that place. Oh, he was at this party, and the photographs of the party don't include him. You have actually biased the decision-making process against your client. Now, when we talk about what the truth is, your client may be completely innocent. We don't know. But from the standpoint of evaluating evidence, as soon as you've made a claim that you can't back up, the people who are evaluating this look at that, and whether it's correct to do so or not, and I think it's not, they actually count that failure as evidence for the prosecution because you tried to present something that you couldn't defend. It's a huge mistake. Well, when people refer to atheists as professing atheists, with the implication that they are saying that they don't believe in a God, but they actually do believe in a God, or worse, that they know or are absolutely certain, they're doing what that defense attorney is doing. I'm sitting here saying, I don't believe that a God exists. And the people who are observing the conversation recognize that we're talking about whether or not I believe, not whether or not a God exists. That's a separate issue. We're talking about whether or not I believe. And when you come and say, oh, you really do believe, you are without excuse, the Bible says so, and you offer all of these reasons that you are convinced that I believe, I know that you're wrong. I know that I'm not being dishonest when I say I don't believe. I don't believe. I am not yet convinced that a God exists. And in many cases, depending on the definition of a God, I am convinced that they don't exist. But by calling me a professed atheist and then trying to have the conversation to back it up, you are implying dishonesty. Whether it's intentional deception, whether it is delusion, you're implying all those things, and you're doing so to the jury. And in this case, when you're having a conversation with me, I'm the jury. You're trying to make the case that your God has given you information and has said these things, these factual things about the world. And I now have concrete, or as close to concrete proof as anyone could possibly get, I think, that you're wrong. Because if your God is telling you that I'm lying, now I might be deceived, it might be suppressed. If you're going to say that I'm unaware of it, then I don't know how we can have a conversation about this. But if you're saying that I really do believe, but I'm saying I don't believe, I now know you're wrong. what does that say about your God? If in fact your God exists, he's either giving you bad information, or you're misunderstanding it, or your God doesn't exist. Either way, something about your model is demonstrably wrong. You have adopted a burden of proof to show that you can read my mind. And that is almost always going to be a mistake. There's another example, circumstance where this reading of minds pops up. So in a number of political discussions, I see people who are very much in support of a particular issue or opposed to a particular issue, who are desperate to frame the opposition in such a way that they are the enemy, that they are evil. And they may well be. I'm not necessarily, we're clearly at odds over an issue. One example is I've seen and talked to people about, for example, abortion rights. And I've heard people who are in favor of a right to choose talk about the far right-wing anti-choice crowd in terms that say they just want to control sex. They just want to punish women. They just want to make women slaves to their biology. You've now made a claim about what's inside somebody else's mind. You're talking about their desire and motivation, and you have a burden of proof to demonstrate that you're actually correct. And if you can't, you may have inadvertently, whether it's right or wrong to do for this to happen, you may have inadvertently added credibility to the opposition. And a far better tactic is to say they are advocating legislation that makes women slaves to their biology, that exercises control over sex and things like that. Now you're not talking about their motivation. You're talking about what they're actually doing. And that's a case that you can actually make. Pretending that you can actually get into somebody's head is almost always a mistake. It's much better to ask them questions, let them condemn themselves if in fact they're guilty, or get to the truth of the matter of what their actual motivations and goals are. It doesn't do any good to say you're a professing atheist. Well, okay, why were we talking about this? Well, are you saying I'm lying? Are you suggesting that I believe and don't believe at the same time? What's going on here? This doesn't make sense, because if of all the things that I'm confident about, I'm at least confident that I don't actually believe this and that I'm not, in fact, being dishonest. So there's an experiment that I've done in email many times, and I actually did it on my Facebook wall just the other day. People who are advocating for particular religious positions will often email, and they'll have an important message to me that may or may not be portrayed initially as coming from their God. And what I'll often do is say, okay, you need to go and pray and talk to God and find out what it is that God wants you to tell me. Because the next email I get from you or the next post I get from you, I'm going to use to evaluate your God. Now, if your God wants you to talk to me and wants you to try to convince me, then it seems reasonable that he would give you the correct tools to do so. So if you come back with yet another version of Pascal's wager or arguments that are riddled with fallacies, then I'll know one of a few different things. Either your God doesn't exist, or your God doesn't understand logic and reasoning, doesn't know anything about me, doesn't know what it would take to convince me, or didn't give you that message, or that you never even asked your God for help. One of those things is the case. But if you were to come back with something amazing and profound, something that ultimately did change my mind, well, now all of a sudden you might have met your burden of proof. I don't know what that would look like, because it doesn't tend to happen. And I've used that in email, I've used it on Facebook, because that way I'm not assuming anybody else's motivations. I'm not necessarily asserting something that has with it a burden of proof. I am challenging them within the bounds of their own doctrine. Now, there are plenty of believers who, thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test, or I'm not going to pray to God to get that kind of information because God doesn't work that way. Okay, cool. You have a particular version of God. But it seems to conflict with the idea that you think God wants you to talk to me about this. And he's not giving you the tools to do so. So either you're wrong about God wanting to do this, or he's not particularly bright when it comes to having the sort of conversations that are likely to convince somebody. And it's kind of strange that you have this scenario where people will say secretly, deep down inside, atheists aren't atheists. They secretly, deep down inside, believe that a God exists, and they'll cite the passage in Romans 1. But the passage in Psalm 14 says, "The fool hath said in his heart there is no God." It's basically saying deep down inside, there are people who don't believe. And it kind of counters this idea that we're merely paying lip service to the idea by saying that no, at their core, there are people who don't accept that a God exists or outright deny that a God exists. So the big tips are, don't pretend like you can read somebody else's mind. And don't pretend that like you have a magic friend who can read somebody else's mind, unless you actually do and that friend is giving you information. If you're basing it on your own suspicions and interpretations, when you start talking about someone as a professed atheist or a professed Christian, implying that there's something dishonest about their position, you're really making a mistake, and you are perhaps adopting a burden of proof that you can't meet, and one that actually damages your position. Now, atheists do this too. I can't count the number of times that I've heard from atheists that, well, Christians, these theists, they just really don't believe that stuff. Yeah, I did. And so did most of the former Christians that I met and interacted with. Now, I'm not immune to this. I'm as guilty of it as anybody else, because I've pointed out that in particular conversations with some theists, it seems and it feels like maybe somewhere deep down they don't believe. And that's a tempting route to go down. Somewhere down there, they're doubting. They're not as confident as they express. It may be true, it may not be true. But it's a mistake to say, oh, come on, you know this deep down. You're just a professing Christian. Because now you've made a claim that you can't back up. And it's about what's inside them. And those are the ones that are the most difficult, because even if they're wrong, even if I'm wrong, we have this very strong impression that we know ourselves. And for somebody else to come in and suggest that we don't know ourselves and that they know us better is a big mistake. And for the Christians who do this, they need to be extra careful, because they're the ones who are asserting that they have potentially an infallible source who's making these declarations. The problem is that they have to go back to the Bible. And this is why I recommend asking them what they would view, how they would view me calling them a professing Christian. Because the truth of the situation is that they're advocating for a book and a religion that holds that many, if not most of the people who identify as a Christian aren't. And so from the perspective of their model, I actually have a better argument that they're not really a Christian than they could ever have that I'm not really an atheist. Why would you take on a position that is so self-defeating? And wouldn't it be better to just have a conversation where when somebody tells you what they believe and what they don't believe, you accept that this is what they're saying and that this seems to be consistent with how they feel. And if you have suspicions that they're being dishonest about what they believe or what they don't believe, that you then ask the questions that get you to the conclusion rather than assuming the conclusion. I'm a professing atheist. I'm also an actual atheist. And the professing label doesn't add anything to your position. All it does is detract. And it makes me all the more convinced, whether I should be or not, that you're not actually in communication with someone who knows or understands me at all.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.